certainly have fears that there is a serial killer at loose in Perth.
Sarah Spears, Jane Rimmer, Ciara Glennon.
And every time you saw a young girl walking by, you think, oh God, is she going to be the next victim?
Now, one man stands accused.
If police are right and Edwards is the Claremont serial killer, he's been hiding in plain sight for 20 years.
It was back in the 1990s when the bodies of Jane Rimmer and Ciara Glennon were discovered. It's now been revealed there was no police protocol for wearing protective clothing at crime scenes. Welcome to day 22 of Claremont in Conversation. I'm Natalie Bonjolo in the studio with Alison Fan and Tim Clark. And I must admit, I actually found this quite surprising today, this testimony.
It was. It did come as a big surprise because up until today, the police have been very, very careful about how they described what they did to preserve the crime scenes, how mindful they were where they walked, didn't touch the bodies, and were wearing protective clothing and gloves. But today we heard a different story, that the protective clothing that they were wearing was to protect them personally from dirt and that, and not really because of cross-contamination or DNA, which they had never heard of back in 1996 or knew little about that in 1996 and 1997.
Yeah, it was surprising, wasn't it? And I've said all week how impressive Mr. Hemelaar's evidence has been,
yes.
how precise he's been, how forensic he's been. And I mean, to be fair, he was pretty precise when he was asked today, and he basically said no, we wouldn't wear gloves. As a matter of course, we wouldn't put booties on our feet over our shoes. As a matter of course, he had the same pair of boots that he wore to his crime scene boots. So he didn't get whatever sort of
several crime scene boots, probably
whatever sort of matter that he might be dealing with on his clothes. They did wear overalls, and there were gloves as a practice. He said when you were actually touching deceased matter.
But Tim, the big thing was the bare hands, wasn't it?
Yes, well, that's right, and no hair nets or anything like that. So we've all got an image, I suppose, of sort of forensic officers covered head to toe, sort of hazmat suits and no bare flesh showing. But back in 96, 97, this wasn't the case, apparently. And because we couldn't see the video, this all sort of came as a bit of a surprise. If we'd been able to see the video, obviously, we would have probably picked it up earlier. But as this was being sort of teased out by Paul Yovich today, the sort of bits that we couldn't see and weren't pointed out by the prosecution did come to the fore.
Well, today's trial actually opened with the judge asking the question himself. Justice Stephen Hall said to Robert Hemelaar, "Did you wear gloves at all times?" And that's when he said no. The protocols back then, there were no written regulations or rules that the gloves weren't worn all of the time. And that was followed up by Paul Yovich later on when he said there is a photograph of you or a recording of you putting some of the foliage into a brown or paper bag, and it didn't all go in, so he used his hands to push the rest of it into the bag so they could seal it. So that was quite revealing.
And does he describe that that's what happened?
Yes, it wasn't. He said they were doing what they thought was right. They had nobody knew anything about DNA back then. Technology was in its infancy as far as crime scenes and cross-contamination went. There was nothing in writing. They used their common sense. He said we were mindful about where we walked and we certainly didn't touch the bodies, but that was mainly following probably the forensic pathologists' rules and regulations, don't touch, don't contaminate. But they had nothing in writing, and they just did what they thought was best at the time.
Yeah, and it was more to protect themselves than to protect the scene. It appeared from the evidence today that their priority was not to get themselves dirty or possibly infected with, if they were dealing with that sort of noxious material, rather than protect the scene itself.
And that sounds right, because of course AIDS was a big thing still coming at that time. Over the blood, even blood rule now sent off, so they would have been protecting themselves from anything like that, not thinking of cross-contamination or DNA.
And like you said, we sort of have this image of pure and sterile, and sort of in more recent years and in more recent decade, we watch these crime shows and we watch Bones and CSI, and this is what we expect. But we are talking 23 years ago.
Yeah, which is a lifetime in scientific terms, obviously, and several generations on. And as Brendan was saying yesterday on the podcast's I mean, it would be light years away from now, from what they did then. And Mr. Hemelaar today was basically quite candid when he said, you wouldn't do that today, would you? And he said, no, definitely not. So yeah, interesting little tidbits, and no doubt more to come, because there's many more forensic officers and evidence to come next week.
Well, of course, this has been a very, very big part of the trial, the whole collecting of the fibres, how the fibres got onto the body, and of course the prosecution says, well, those certain fibres point to Bradley Robert Edwards. But even the way they bagged the evidence, and there were several labels and several handwriting, and they couldn't remember who actually labelled it and numbered it, and a lot of discrepancies there with times. But it just was a different, mindset in dealing with evidence and not realising the importance and significance years on.
Well, when we spoke to Brendan Chapman yesterday, who is a forensic expert here in Western Australia, and he explained that when they'd put an item into a bag, the bag would be folded over and then it would have a tamper tape.
Yes. They talked about that today, the tamper evidence tape, that once that was on and it was taken off, you could tell when it was open. But that didn't exist back in 1996 or 1997. In fact, when you think back, you can't even think when computers did start to overtake your life. And he was saying too, everything was handwritten, and they was comparing handwritten notes at the scene, then typed later on, and they were trying, some of those, there were discrepancies in those as well. But it's hard to think back of when the computers did take over and everything was computerised.
Yeah, there was even many mentions of dot matrix printouts, which some of our younger listeners probably won't know what the hell I'm talking about. But long before digital recordings, obviously, I mean, there was video recording, but done on a VHS tape, once again, probably in a different era. And I remember VHS, and Ali probably was.
Thank you. I'm sure I do.
Yes.
I remember film, and I remember Sony. Yes, all of that. Thank you, Tim.
But yeah, I was just light years away from what you would expect, and particularly at such a crucial crime scene for what seems now to be such sort of basic things that weren't being done.
What were some of the discrepancies in the recording of the exhibits and what have you?
Again, from just so many people handling various things, and things were written in texter. Then there was a label. Then the only way that Robert Hemelaar said today that he could realise that one was a later one, because there was a particular barcode that was used that didn't come in until down the track. So they're up to, and he couldn't even recognise the writing. There's so many people handled the evidence and open and close that bag, which I'm sure the defence is going to hone in on.
Yeah. So particular things that were pointed out today. There's a hair sample that was taken from Ciara at the scene. They basically just snipped a lock of her hair and secured it in a yellow pot, which is going to be very crucial, because prosecutors say that when that hair sample was tested more than 20 years later, rereading the transcript today, in opening, Miss Barbagallo said that piece of hair was placed in this yellow pot, marked as an evidence RH17, and then sat on a shelf for 21 years and wasn't retested until basically after Mr. Edwards was arrested. And then two of these crucial blue fibres were found in that hair sample. But when the video recording was being taken of the scene by Mr. Tarachi, who we discussed earlier in the week, that was not on the video recording. And we don't know why, whether that was one of the gaps in the recording that we discussed earlier, or whether he was just happened to be filming something else at that time. And once again, as was discussed earlier, he explained that it wasn't common practice or standard practice for every piece of evidence taken at the scene to be filmed, and he wouldn't say, can I get that on film? Or the forensic officer wouldn't say, we are now about to, can you film this? And as I say, RH17 is going to become very crucial, because two of these blue fibres were reportedly or allegedly in there. There was the tamper tape that we've discussed. So on that little pot, RH17, which we saw a picture of in court today, there was actual tape on top, and as Ali mentioned, there was also a barcode on there. But both those procedures didn't start for many years after 97. So that pot has obviously been touched and
Handled by a number of people.
because the tape was on there, which wasn't on there at the
Time.
contemporaneously, and the barcode. So, I mean, that'll probably re-emerge as an issue, and as I say, and then the gloves as well. So, and there's little discrepancies in labelling of exhibits in the police system, which was called PTS. It was a property tracking system, and the process was you'd get a piece of evidence, you'd label it, and then you'd go back to the office and you'd input it into the police computer. But once again, Mr. Hemelaar was very candid today and says, well, that software was a piece of crap, basically, because it wouldn't let you input your own description. It was just a drop-down menu, and you had to choose
It generated its
certain
own numbers,
subject matters or whatever. And then it was pointed out that one of the hairbrushes that was taken from Jane's flat had a different PTS number from one printout to the other. So it's what we discussed a couple of weeks ago about when Mr. Yovich, in his opening, said, well, the prosecution want to paint this perfectly hermetically sealed picture of everything just flowing smoothly, and all these samples went here, there and everywhere, but they were never and he said there's rough edges here. That's a picture, but we say that's not the full picture. And a few of those missing pieces started to emerge this week, particularly later in the week when Mr. Yovich got to his feet and did his cross-examination.
Because at the end of the day, what you're talking about is really crucial material. This is what the prosecution's case hinges on.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Could this be their undoing?
Well, we're not going to say.
Well, but that's what Mr. Yovich is pointed to on day 2 or 3 of the trial.
He did.
And that's what he will continue to point to, because it's not a case of him proving the prosecution wrong. It's reasonable doubt, and
the crucial
reasonable doubt is a lot lower bar to reach than the prosecution's got to reach, which is beyond reasonable doubt.
Yes,
And so if he can keep just bringing up these little issues and pile them on top of each other, and then way down the track in a few months, when he gets up and does his closing argument, he will have them all stacked and will remind the judge of them all. And he will hope that once that the inbox and the outbox are stacked up, that he's done enough to create that reasonable doubt.
Was Robert Hemelaar's sort of memory being tested today? Was his ability to recall these events from, decades ago under scrutiny?
Yes, it was. But he was a very, I thought, credible witness, and he was quite open when he couldn't remember exact things. He said, there are things that you'll never forget, but you're asking me minute details about who was there and what was written. No, he was quite candid and was saying to the defence lawyer, no, I didn't remember that. And because sometimes there were running sheets where his writing was on, and then the next one was writing he couldn't recognise. He thought it might have been one of the 2 of his colleagues, but he wasn't prepared to say that definitively. So he was, I thought, a very, very honest and candid witness.
Yeah, I mean, some of his recall was remarkable, certainly about which personnel and which officers were there and their names and what their jobs were and what they did. And of course, he had the video particularly the Ciara Glennon video that was showed in full to him. So that and the proofing process before trial, it's not a case of just a person turning up with no preparation or aid memoirs. I mean, he would have seen his statements and he would have seen the running sheets, and he told the court that he had. So, and trials like this, or any trial, they don't really want it to be a memory test. They don't want a criminal prosecution to stand or fall on someone being able to remember everything from 25 years ago, because that wouldn't be fair. But
he was shown his statements. He's given about 5 or 6. They said the first statements were a couple of years after the actual murders, and the most recent was 2016, and then probably before he came on he would have had probably a look at things, but he was very honest in everything that he didn't know and what had been done, and He said, especially about the protocol back then, it just wasn't written in. They used their common sense, but he said there were no written rules.
Probably.
And when it was revealed today that, there was no strict rules for wearing gloves or popping booties on and these kinds of things, was there any noticeable reactions in the courtroom, audible or visible?
Well, not really, no, not really. And but not only no strict rules, there were no rules. The bare hands one was a bit of a shock to me when they said, he just used his hands to push the evidence back into the bag.
Yeah, no, there wasn't any particular, intake of breath, but I wouldn't be surprised if there was a couple of raised eyebrows on some tables somewhere, whether in court or outside. And I'll be very interested to see what Brendan's got to say about it when he joins us again in terms of those protocols then and now, and I mean, and it was obviously very fluid because he did say that the booties, for instance, by the time, so between Jane's body being discovered and Ciara, that had actually come in, and they were more likely to wear the booties. Even in that 8 months, they were obviously always sort of trying to improve their process.
The awareness of technology, he said, was marginally better from 1996 to 1997.
As we know, though, as you've mentioned, from all the evidence that's been presented so far by the witnesses, nobody has admitted to actually touching the bodies, have they?
No one that shouldn't have.
No one that shouldn't.
Particularly, I mean, we're discussing it after court today. There seemed to be a very sort of strong party line, or a sort of strong consistency of all the detectives and senior police that were there. They all, even without prompting, said we didn't go near the body. There was no reason to, and we've no reason to think that they were making that up or exaggerating or elaborating on that.
Well,
but
they did know about fingerprint.
Yes, exactly.
Stuff like that, so they knew not to touch anything.
They were all very strong on that, and there wasn't really any pushback from the defence on that. But those that were tasked to touch the body, they were there, and certainly they will. At least two more we know of that forensic team will be some of the very early witnesses next week, and so I'm sure they'll be asked very similar things.
Tim, there was one point that I thought was quite interesting with the late Karen Margolius, when they were asked about the ground sheet that they used to try to roll the body on, and nobody had one. And they said, and Karen apparently said, "Oh, well, I've got one in my car," but they didn't follow up on that ground sheet which they used to transfer the body into the body bag, and that was sort of the defence brought that up.
That was a little breadcrumb that did pique my interest as well, because there was very pointed questioning about
had it been used before.
Well,
or
certainly body bags were they were supposed to be pristine, and they were.
One use only.
They were sealed when they got to the crime scene, and then you unsealed them there and then used them again. But the fact that she knew she had this sheet in her car, now whether she just put it in there as a process, but it was a little breadcrumb that might turn into a life.
Yeah. And as we mentioned yesterday, she won't be called to give evidence because sadly she passed away back in 2010.
Yeah, she did. She died in 2010. Yeah. I mean, she was hugely respected throughout her career. I saw her give evidence many times,
absolutely.
as you did.
Yes, I did. Yes, absolutely.
And she was very she was a bit of a pioneer as in terms of forensic pathology, being the lead forensic pathologist as a woman at that time. But she was also one of the only forensic pathologists in Australia that also had a law degree. She was actually legally trained and qualified as well as in pathology. So it'd be interesting to see how her actions are actually explored. Now she's no longer with us. I remember there will be evidence called that an expert, could even be Clive Cook, I'm not sure, who's one of the other pathologists, will sort of go through her actions, particularly during the post-mortem, and sort of review them, review them on the spot.
Yeah, he was there.
So that'll be, obviously, during the post-mortem, that'll be one way that they could do it, because it was all filmed.
Well, we've got some listener questions pertaining specifically to DNA. So Teresa from the Gold Coast has asked, when the police obtained the DNA from Bradley Edwards, what made them decide to follow him in particular? I understand that they had old DNA from the Karrakatta Cemetery and from under Ciara Glennon's fingernails, but what made them decide to track Bradley Edwards?
I think we touched on this in previous podcasts, but we can go through it again quickly. So the kimono that we've discussed, which was the kimono that was left behind at the Huntingdale scene, that had been in storage for many, many years. And a cold case detective just happened to pull that box in 2016, got the kimono out, tested it, and that DNA matched the DNA under Ciara's fingernails and also from the Karrakatta victim, but they still didn't have a source of that DNA. So then they went back in the Huntingdale area, retraced their steps prior to that break-in. There were other break-ins and strange sort of creeping, stalking incidents where underwear was being taken off washing lines and from actually inside houses in the weeks leading up to the Huntingdale break-in. During one of those, some fingerprints were found. So the cold case detectives then, who were on high alert because they knew this was linked to Claremont and Macro, tested those fingerprints and then ran them through the national database. That database popped up Bradley Edwards' name because of his involvement in the Hollywood Hospital crime in 1990, and that was when they had that name. It was then that they threw all their resources to tracking and surveilling Mr. Edwards, and it was during one of those surveillings that he went to the cinema with his daughter and discarded a Sprite bottle. As we all know, we all throw our rubbish very dutifully into the bins when we've been to the movies. This is what he did. Police swooped on that Sprite bottle, ran a DNA test on that, and that came back as a match to all those three samples. And so that was basically when Mr. Edwards was arrested. And a better, what they call a buccal swab, which is the swab from inside of the mouth, was then taken during Mr. Edwards' interview. That came back positive, and he was basically charged on that basis with Jane and Ciara's murder. So quite a circuitous route, which will be explored as we go along in the trial, because we understand the arrest process is not objected to by the defence, but it will have to be covered off by the prosecution.
And of course he's pleaded guilty to those rape charges.
Correct. Absolutely, yes. And he has, as Ali said, he's pleaded guilty to the Huntingdale break-in, so there's no doubt that it was him. And he's pleaded guilty to the Karrakatta rape, so there's no doubt that it was him there. But the $64 million question will be that sample from Karrakatta, which was kept in the Pathwest laboratory, did that at any time come into contact with the DNA sample under Ciara's fingernails, because that's what the defence say, that there was some likelihood of cross-contamination.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite an extraordinary chain that begins with this kimono. Did you say we know why the kimono was brought out?
It was just WA, Western Australia, has a very active cold case unit. Have had for many, many years, and they were sort of ticking off all the crimes that had not been solved over the years. So it wasn't any particular Macro or Claremont investigation that took that box. It was a cold case unit that took that box out, but that started the chain of events that's led us here 3 years later.
The fingerprints on a door as he left behind way back then. Yeah. And of course the Hollywood attack didn't come under notice because it wasn't a sexually charge.
We have another question from Natalie, who asks, just wondering whether any of Jane's clothes were recovered from the scene or anywhere else for that matter, and also whether there was any traces of blood or DNA recovered from the knife found.
Well, the knife was, they've said there's been no forensic.
No, that's that's right. So it's been said in court. There's no
nothing there.
significant forensic material on that knife. So we don't really know how long it was there. We don't know how much of the elements it was exposed to, and there's certainly no positive link between either crime. But it was given that it was at Jane's crime scene, particularly Jane, no blood, no DNA, nothing of any import at all forensically. But the prosecution obviously point to the massive coincidence that a Telstra issue knife that was very similar, exactly, in fact identical to ones that Mr. Edwards had and did still have, was found at that scene.
As for the clothing, we haven't heard anything.
No, there's no suggestion. So Jane's body was naked, and we've heard some detail about this week, but none of her clothes have ever been discovered, as far as we know.
Only her watch.
Yep.
And still along those same lines from Sue Ellen, has it come out during the trial as to the actual cause of death of both Jane and Ciara?
Well, yes.
That's a good question, actually, because yes and no, I suppose, is the answer.
They talked about the neck.
Yes, so there was
wounds.
significant, what they called defects to the neck and face of both Jane and Ciara. And obviously significant blood loss, particularly in Ciara's case, with her T-shirt that she was wearing was very heavily bloodstained, and there was bloodstain underneath her body when it was removed, which suggests that she did bleed out at the scene, which would again suggest that she was attacked there. So significant wounds, which the prosecution say are similar in style, sort of jagged cuts to the back and side of the neck and face. But 100%, we haven't seen a document that says cause of death or anything like that. But I mean, you can surmise when the wounds are that significant that they were noticeable weeks later after the bodies were dumped and weeks on discovery. That would have been a significant issue.
Tim, were both bodies face down?
They were.
Yeah, so the cuts were at the back of the neck, you're saying?
Yes, side and the back of the neck.
Because at one stage I think they were arguing about whether it could have been done by birds or animal activity, but so they were both face down.
They were both face down, which and that will become a significant issue quite soon, actually, in terms of the similarities of the scene, because we've gone through the details of the scene, or nearly the scenes, this week and will next week. But then I'm sure the prosecution will come to the fact that they were both face down, they were both in remote bush areas, equidistant north and south of Perth, and also covered with local vegetation taken from the scene. So,
and the post-mortem autopsies will reveal that.
Yeah.
So that's still to come.
It is.
Have you been given an indication of who will take the stand next week?
So there's two
more, please.
there's two forensic witnesses that we definitely know, a Detective Mott and a detective. They're not detectives, are they? They're sergeants.
Another two more.
Yeah, so Mott and Harbridge, who were two of the team that worked at the crime scenes with Rob Hemelaar. But we think the first witness next week is going to be a Dr. Barnard. She was the doctor who was in the sex assault squad or sex assault unit at the time, who treated the victim at Karrakatta after her attack, and then she was obviously dealt with by police, and that will be significant because obviously after a sex attack there are sort of intimate swabs and things taken, and Dr. Barnard would have been the person who took those swabs, and they also link to Mr. Edwards. So that's how we'll start the week. But again, much of it we believe, and for both the rest of the month will be forensics, crime scene, and probably more into post-mortem evidence next week.
And how do the key players in the courtroom appear to be holding up at this stage?
Well, you wouldn't know from Bradley Robert Edwards because his expressions and stance doesn't change at all. I did notice today he nodded to somebody in the gallery. That was his only sort of acknowledgement. Dennis Glennon, Ciara's father, has been there every day. Jane Rimmer's sister comes in every now and then.
Yeah, I think Lee was there today.
Yeah.
But
And
again,
a
defence and
pack-
prosecution, do they look battle weary at any stage? Or
Well, we can't see because we've got the screen across the main players.
That's true.
That big screen across. And, of course, we've got to be careful about reporting what we hear. As the judges said, you probably covered this yesterday, that just because we can hear the audio, it does not, we can't presume it's relating to something that we can't see. And we've already been I think, scolded a little bit by the judge by saying that one media outlet had said somebody, hey, Steve, are you wearing gloves? And it was presumed it was when they were carrying the body. But no, it's probably as he's getting out the car. So we can't sort of just make statements like that that are erroneous.
Yeah, the lawyers are very stoic. They don't really show much emotion in court. The odd light moment, the odd chuckle to themselves and with each other. But as we've said many times, they're very, very experienced barristers, both Miss Barbagallo and Mr. Yovich. They're match fit, and they're probably only probably halfway through the first quarter in terms of the trial length. So
we're also aware of Dennis Glennon sitting there too in the front row, listening to this harrowing stuff about his daughter. Very, very aware of that.
Yeah, you can't help but feel for him.
No.
Well, thank you both for your time in court this week. Claremont podcast at wanews.com.au is where you can contact all of us individually or all together. For a full wrap of this week's evidence, you can grab the West Australian newspaper or head to thewest.com.au, where you'll also find any of the exhibits that have been released by Justice Hall this week. Thanks for your company over the past week. We'll be back on Monday for day 23 of Claremont in Conversation. Have a great weekend, all.
This podcast was hosted by Natalie Bongiorlo, produced by Kate Ryan and Alicia Preedy, and recorded in the studios of 7 West Media. Audio files were provided from the archives of the 7 Network and the West Australian. Sign up for daily emails and all the latest on the Claremont trial at thewest.com.au.
Enjoying this podcast? If the story behind the headline matters to you, then you can count on thewest.com.au to deliver. For more on Claremont the trial, follow the live blog, watch the nightly news updates, and sign up for daily email updates at thewest.com.au. Subscribe now for just $1 a day at thewest.com.au.